to the scientific committee that I have perceived it because I was a member of the scientific committee. So let us put our hands together for Dr. Ram Murthy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Partha, Dr. Saumil, friends. I'll give you a refractive surgery overview. These are my financial disclosures, not of any relevance to the present presentation. Basically, when I look at these eager faces sitting here, I go back to my first presentation made about 15 years back on refractive surgery. It was in one of those halls in Bombay, some hall H. With the help of the sanitary staff, I found that hall and went there. Was waiting. Those days we used to use slides, and I was just about to start my presentation. There's exactly one person in the audience, and I said, waited for a few minutes, then got a little wary that even he might disappear. Went ahead and made my presentation, and then hopefully asked any questions. This person kept absolutely quiet. Then I, quite dejected, I collected my slides and was about to leave when he just tapped on my shoulder and said, "Could you just hold on for a few minutes?" I said, "What for?" He said, "I am the next speaker." So that's the kind of interest that refractive surgery used to evoke about a decade and a half back. Doing radial keratotomy was considered unethical and it was looked down upon. But today, there's been a sea change, and you as young ophthalmologists of the future are going to be dealing with it day in and day out during your professional lifetime. It's going to be accepted almost like cataract surgery. It's not just in ophthalmology. Refractive surgery is the second most commonly performed surgery in the human body. No prizes for guessing what's the first most commonly performed. That's cataract. So we as ophthalmologists, in spite of the numbers that are coming out, the profusion of hospitals that are coming up, are never going to run out of work, because the two most frequently performed elective procedures on the human body remain in the realms of ophthalmology. And more than 35 million procedures have been performed worldwide. You might wonder about the outcomes of this particular surgery. There was a very relevant meta-analysis that was commissioned by ASCRS, and the reports from this is quite revealing. Kerry Solomon conducted this work, and 3,000 peer-reviewed articles based on Ovid and PubMed databases. The keyword that he used was LASIK, and the journals across the world was consulted, and 95% of the 6.6% of the patients were very happy with the results. And mind you, these were publications right from the year 1994. 1988 was the first year that LASIK was performed in the current day form, and there has been a sea change in the way we do the refractive surgery today. But even in those early days, the satisfaction levels were quite high. If you compare it with the other cosmetic elective procedures, LASIK scores over all of them by a wide margin, and it's considered the most procedure which causes the greatest impact as far as the lifetime of the patient is concerned. But statistics can always be looked at another way. Look at this. If you were to tell your patient that there's a 1 in 25% chance, I said that only 96% of the patients are happy. So the 4 patients who are unhappy. If you were to tell your patient who is presenting for refractive surgery, who essentially has a simple refractive error, which is amenable to correction with glasses and contact lenses, there is a 1 in 25 chances that you are going to be unhappy with the ultimate outcome of this procedure. Obviously, hardly anyone is going to look forward to it. So there is enough distance that we have to traverse before we are able to universally accept this. When we started with refractive surgery, this was a single procedure specialty. Initially, it was all PRK. Then subsequently, that surface ablation, I'll be dealing with it. Then it was LASIK. And today we have a gamut of procedures that can be offered to these patients. And essentially, you have to pick and choose what best suits these patients. In the next few minutes, it would be my endeavor to give you a bird's eye view of what the current day technology as far as these procedures are concerned, are the way they are done, the complications, and maybe what would be the way forward. Let me start off with LASIK, which is essentially, in spite of all those multifarious options that are available, still world over, 90% of the procedures is LASIK. LASIK is essentially something that we do bilaterally, And this is a simple procedure, just takes about 8 to 10 minutes for doing it in both eyes. This is a real-time video actually. It's done under topical anesthesia. We put a suction ring onto the eye, and basically you can create a flap either from with a hinge on top or hinge on the side. This I'm using a Hansotome which creates a hinge on top. And this traverses in about 26 seconds. The thickness of the flap, initially we were making about 160, 180 microns. Now we stick to about 120 microns. Lift up the flap, use the submicron accuracy of the excimer laser to reprofile the corneal surface to correct the refractive error that's pre-existent. We just finish one eye and go on to the next eye. The patients are discharged the same day. This is just to show you another instrument that's being used. There's a Moria microkeratome, which essentially creates a hinge nasally. There are advantages and disadvantages to having the hinge nasally or temporally, but suffice it to say that this is another option that is available. There are also instruments available which gives you the opportunity to create the hinge exactly where you want. Basically, this procedure has come to stay. Look at the very uniform surface that has been created, and subsequently the excimer laser ablation. The fuzziness that you see appearing is because of the excimer laser removing corneal tissue very precisely. So depending upon if it is myopia, it's tissue that's removed from the center. If it's the hyperopia, it's removed from the periphery. If it's in cylinder, it's more along the minor cylinder axis that the tissue is removed. We also have progressed quite significantly. Nowadays, almost 50% of the laser refractive corrections that we do are with the femtosecond laser. It's also called the all-laser LASIK. Basically, here we use two different types of lasers. One is the femtosecond laser for creating the flap. A femto in Danish means 15. Basically, it refers to the frequency of this laser. It's 10 to the power of minus 15 seconds is the duration of each pulse. And in 1 second, a light ray can traverse 8 times around the world, and in 1 femtosecond, it can just go by the side of a human hair. That tells you the speed, how small this time period is, and it is because of this that the amount of shock waves, the amount of impact on the adjacent tissue is extremely small, and you are able to precisely control what exactly you want to achieve. This is just a femtosecond laser procedure in progress. This is one of my older femtosecond lasers, which fires just at the rate of 60 hertz. When you say 60 hertz, that means it fires 60 times in a second. And if you say nowadays it's available at 150, 250, 500 hertz, and 500 hertz is something which is much faster. This takes about 4 seconds, while nowadays it's possible to do it in about 6 seconds. Essentially what happens is the femtosecond passes through the anterior layers of the cornea. You can create an extremely precise flap of about 90, 100 microns, 110 microns, and the procedure is anatomy blind. If you're using a mechanical microkeratome, depending upon the individual variations of that particular cornea, from the center to the periphery, there would be a difference in the thickness of the flap that you create. But when you are doing a femtosecond laser, essentially what you saw was a bubble layer that's being created, and then ultimately a gutter that's being formed in the periphery. Then you shift the patient under the excimer laser, and this is just all that there's no cutting that is involved. You just pass a blunt spatula underneath, and you can see the pristine, very clear stroma that is being created, very uniform with a precise control. Of course, this comes at a considerable cost. I would not say that as far as your understanding is concerned, there's not a huge difference as far as outcomes are concerned between the femtosecond laser and the microkeratome flap. But then this gives you the advantages of repeatability, precision, and in case cost is a major concern, you would not be doing anything wrong in using a microkeratome. But if it's precision and the latest technology that's needed, definitely femtosecond laser is a way forward. There are also several customization options that are available. I might be spending just about 8 to 10 minutes as far as doing the procedure is concerned, but usually the patient gets worked up for about 2 to 3 hours because we have to be exactly understand what exactly is the status of the cornea, the status of the rest of the eye. Basically, apart from just correcting the refractive error, that you are able to address a lot of other problems that are there in the eye. I'm not going to go into the details of each and every one of those instruments. The two commonly used instruments are what's called the topographer, essentially which gives you the idea about the corneal shape, both the anterior and the posterior surface, and then the aberrometer, which gives you an idea about the total amount of aberrations that are there in the eye. regarding the types of ablation that is possible, I'm just going to give you an overview. Essentially, it's called the aspheric ablation is what we do most often. What exactly is this asphericity? Each shot of the excimer laser is supposed to remove about 0.25 microns of tissue very precisely. Then the fluence of this spot varies from whether it's falling in the center or in the periphery. In the periphery, because of the angulation, essentially the amount of tissue that's removed is somewhat small. So even though you are correcting -3 diopters in the entire 6 millimeter optic zone size, the amount of tissue taken out in the center is a little more than what is happening in the periphery. And this induces a certain amount of spherical aberration. So you start off with a prolate cornea. A prolate cornea is one where the central area is more curved than the peripheral cornea, while you end up with an oblate cornea, which has a significant amount of higher order aberrations. Oblate cornea is what the frogs have. So even though you might have corrected the refractive error quite accurately, and in your refractive lane, the patient might be having a 6/6 visual acuity, the amount of the kind of quality of vision that you leave this patient behind is somewhat deficient. So the wavefront optimized treatment somewhat tries to address that by precisely removing tissue in this particular area by concentrating a little more shots in this area, so that the kind of the amount of tissue that's removed and the profile of the treatment is exactly the same, whether it's in the center or the periphery, and the amount of spherical aberration induced is much smaller. Today, most of the refractive surgical practices are doing this wavefront optimized as the standard treatment, restricting other options to areas where there are other challenges that are there. You might have heard of this Zernike's polynomials. Basically, there are up to about 63rd order of higher order aberrations that have been understood. But you need not get confused with all of them. What's clinically relevant is only up to the 10th order, and even more practically relevant to you as a practicing refractive surgeon is only up to the 5th order. What are these? Just ignore the order number 1. That's basically some kind of a tilt which is not quite relevant. When you talk about order 2, that's the spherical error and the astigmatism. That's what comes in over here. And when you are talking about a plano-LASIK treatment, a contact lens, a glasses, essentially what you are addressing is the sphere and the cylinder. What is the 3rd order aberration? That is the coma that is there, that's usually pre-existent. And when you are talking about a wavefront guided treatment, where you are capturing data about the aberrations that are there in the eye and subsequently treating it, essentially this is the coma and the trefoil that you are trying to reduce. And what's the 4th order? That the most important in that is the spherical aberration, which I already alluded to. Every eye has a certain amount of spherical aberration in it, and it's most often in the anterior surface of the cornea. It was thought to be a fixed figure of -0.27 RMS value, but today we understand that just as a refractive error, there can be a variation in that. You can measure this, and most importantly, not induce this in your treatment and try to compensate for it. So when I am talking about a wavefront guided treatment, it essentially deals with lessening the amount of pre-existent coma and trefoil and lessening the amount of spherical aberration that's induced by your treatment. Basically, the RMS, the root mean square, essentially this was what I alluding to. The patient might be 6/6 visual acuity after your treatment, but if he has a significant amount of glare, halos, and night vision difficulty, and if this is what he is seeing, he is going to be obviously a very unhappy patient. When you are talking about a wavefront optimized treatment, maybe the induction of these kind of aberrations is significantly reduced. And you go for a wavefront guided treatment when the RMS value of the root mean square value of the amount of aberrations is beyond 0.35 microns. Basically, the distribution of the higher order aberrations is very highly variant. Just like the number of RBs, the amount of pigment cells, it can be highly variable, and it has no relationship to the kind of refractive error that the patient has. A patient with a -10 diopter of refractive error might be having very low higher order aberration, having very good quality vision with his refractive correction. Another emmetropic patient might be having a lot of higher order aberrations, because of which his quality of vision may be quite poor, even though he's not wearing glasses. That's one of the reasons that you might come across patients who say that I find night driving extremely difficult. There's another myope wearing very thick glasses who is quite comfortable doing this. It is because there's more to vision than just the numbers that we put down as far as the refractive error is concerned. More and more, as you move forward in your professional lifetime, you would be dealing more with the quality of vision than just with the quantity of vision. And there are a lot of challenges in that, and some of them are already being met. As far as the corneal surface itself is concerned, this can be quite irregular. You can have some of the earlier treatments, because we wanted to use less amount of tissue. When I started off with LASIK in 1997, we used to use a 4 millimeter optic zone. Today, I would never come less than 6 millimeters, and because this induces a lot of aberrations in the eye, a decentered treatment, old radial keratotomy, post-keratoplasty, asymmetrical cornea, corneal scars, all these things induce aberrations or make the corneal surface irregular, causing a significant irregular astigmatism as well as a significant drop in the quality of vision. For these eyes, what we do is what's called a topo-guided treatment. You find an example over here. This is a cornea which is quite steep over here, somewhat flat over here. This is the profile of the treatment that I have done, where I am taking off tissue over here and not taking off any tissue over here. Basically here, the ablation pattern is decided upon by the kind of information that I get from on the corneal surface. So that I leave behind something like this. This is what I call an oblique bow tie, but the cornea is far more symmetrical. Here, when I talk about the topo-guided treatment, the idea is not to get rid of the refractive error, but essentially to make the cornea more uniform in shape. And subsequently, maybe a second treatment, if enough corneal tissue is available, you can take off the refractive error in a second treatment. So because of this, because of the regularization of the cornea that happens over here, this patient's quality of vision is going to significantly improve, even though he or she might require a refractive correction outside. So essentially, after this, if necessary, we can do a wavefront guided treatment. I mentioned about surface ablation. That's essentially what's done on the corneal surface. Now, today we understand that the corneal hysteresis is an extremely important factor, and whenever you do a laser refractive correction, whether it's on the surface or with the flap, there is enough amount of deformability of the cornea that's induced, which promotes the concept, which induces the keratoectasia. Basically, even though LASIK in its present form was practiced since 1988, it was only almost in 2002 that the term iatrogenic keratoectasia was coined. This is definitely a major bugbear in the sense the cornea becomes unstable, starts protruding forward. There's induction of refractive error as well as quality of vision goes down. So in these cases, we do not create a flap. Whenever there is a suspect cornea, when the corneal thickness is between 450 to 500 microns, then we do not create a flap, but essentially do what's called a surface ablation, where we just scrape off the epithelium and go ahead and do the treatment. And these are some of the options of doing this. Essentially, here I'm using an epikeratome, a very precise instrument which just peels off the epithelium. Over here, I'm using the excimer laser itself, which at 50 microns thickness, just taking away the epithelium, which is about 50 microns. Over here, the alcohol is used at 20% concentration, poured in that bed, which loosens up the epithelium, which can be scraped off. And here, I'm just using a simple Bart Parker knife, a 15-blade knife, to remove the epithelium. Irrespective of the kind of procedure that's used, it has been documented the ultimate results are essentially the same. So subsequently, you place a pledget of mitomycin C at 0.02% concentration, usually in my case for about 30 seconds. It varies from 12 seconds to 2 minutes. Essentially, it's reduced. There's the effect of cytokines, reduces the amount of haze formation. This is a much more safer way of doing a laser refractive correction than creating a flap. But the main reason we do not do this is that as a routine is these patients are quite uncomfortable for 2 or 3 days. You need to place a contact lens which is used usually for 3 days. After 3 days, then you have to put these patients on a significant amount of steroids for about a couple of months. And then there's also more chance of haze and regression that happens. Usually we limit this up to just about -6 diopters of myopia and up to about +2 or +3 diopters of hyperopia or astigmatism. Essentially, this is an important adjunct to the treatment with laser vision correction. And almost 10% of our laser vision corrections today are done using a surface ablation procedure. There's been a very important step forward as far as accuracy of treatment with the excimer lasers is concerned. That's the concept of eye tracking, which has been taken essentially much from the space research. Basically, there's two steps to laser vision correction. One is acquisition of data, which might be just your simple refraction, your corneal topography, your abrometry. And then this is transposed onto the corneal surface using your excimer laser. So if the data that is acquired is not what is exactly treated on the cornea, in spite of the precision of the equipment, the accuracy of the equipment, the speed of your lasers, obviously the results are going to be suboptimal. So essentially, just to ensure that what you treat is what you acquire, this eye tracking is necessary. So there are different stages of eye tracking, where one is called the passive eye tracking, where if the the eyeball moves in any direction beyond 1.5 millimeter, the laser just stops. And then subsequently, you can reposition the patient's eye and go ahead with the treatment. Then you have infrared eye tracking, where there are infrared transposers which are concentrating on the eye, acquiring data, sending on to transponders in the eye, which depending upon the saccadic movements of the eye, essentially moves the mirrors of the laser delivery system so as to follow the movements. Iris recognition is a very important concept that has been introduced. It has been estimated that 1 in 5 individuals might have exactly the same kind of thumbprint across the world. So don't be surprised if you come across a person who has the same kind of thumbprint as you. But it takes about 10 to the power of 23 individuals to have the same kind of iris pattern. So even the two eyes of the same patient doesn't have the same kind of iris pattern. And this is a concept that is used to essentially follow the movements of the eye. Dynamic rotational eye tracking is again when you have acquired data and subsequently on the fly, the movements of the eye is being followed. This is just an exaggeration of what this eye tracking means. In spite of the fact that the patient might be appearing to be fixating very well on the light which he is supposed to see, usually it's a red spot that is shining onto the patient's eye. This kind of minute saccadic movements, which may not be visible even to the surgeon, is constantly going on. It's essentially because of this eye tracking that the laser essentially follows this movements of the eye in a very precise manner so that the excimer laser delivery and the removal of corneal tissue happens extremely well. I've been saying that I've been doing LASIK correction for about almost 15 years. But even today, if a lady with a -2 diopters walks into my clinic with an absolutely normal eye with a corneal thickness of 560 microns, ask me, forget about quality of vision, can you give me an assurance that -2 diopters will be completely gone? I don't even want a 0.25. There's no way I can give her that kind of assurance. It's simply because it's not a deficiency of the instrumentation, but it is because we have not understood the corneal biomechanics quite completely. For the same amount of excimer laser ablation, there are some corneas which treat completely the refractive error disappears. There are some which have a small residual error left over. Again, there's the concept of iatrogenic keratoconus. We talk about leaving behind at least 250, 260 microns in the bed untreated. Today, my standard is to leave 300 microns in the bed untreated. In spite of this, even after a small refractive error being treated, then some of these patients end up with a keratoconus. It's essentially because it's not just the thickness of the cornea that matters, but it is also the hysteresis of the cornea that's important. So this is one dimension that has been talked about for almost a decade today. It was way back in 2002 that one of the foremost leaders in refractive surgery, Margaret MacDonald, said that corneal hysteresis would be the most important determining factor as far as refractive surgery's movement forward is concerned. But even 12 years today from then, even today we have not understood this quite completely. We have an instrument called the ocular response analyzer, which gives us an idea about the corneal hysteresis. This also gives you an idea about the corneal compensated intraocular pressure, which is quite important when you are dealing with patients who have already undergone a prior refractive surgery. But the repeatability of these machines leaves much to be desired. Essentially, I want you to leave you behind with the thought that corneal biomechanics is an extremely important factor, and this is one of the reasons that we are not able to give absolute assurance as far as results are concerned. Riboflavin, you must be all heard about this corneal collagen cross-linkage. Essentially, this is where you debride the corneal epithelium, subsequently expose the eye to riboflavin and create a corneal collagen cross-linkage. It is essentially used in the treatment of keratoconus, iatrogenic keratoconus, Therian's marginal degeneration, and even in some cases of corneal melt. This has again come a long way. It was just about 7 to 8 years back that when a patient had keratoconus, all that we could offer him was glasses, semi-soft lenses, hard lenses. Once it goes beyond that, maybe go ahead and do a corneal transplant. Today, this has come to stay. Within the last 5-6 years, world over, this has got accepted, and several advances again have taken place. Time does not permit me to go into the details of this, but this is a very exciting picture that allows the exciting load of modality of treatment that allows you to improve upon the corneal hysteresis of the particular cornea, arrest the progression of keratoconus, in some cases even achieve the correction of the refractive error more accurately. There have been advances in instrumentation, UV power modulation, riboflavin options, etc. There are several different options that are available. Sorry about that. This is the way this treatment is carried on. This actually is an eye which has already undergone laser refractive correction, developed iatrogenic keratoconus. You will find that the flap margins come up as we move forward, and you can see this epithelium being debrided. You can even use alcohol for that, but then you are not very sure about the interaction that takes place between riboflavin and the alcohol. Essentially, the debridement is done with a Bart Parker knife, and subsequently we expose it to riboflavin. The total amount of energy that's impinged upon the eye is about 5.4 joules per meter square. And previously we are exposing it for 30 minutes, and nowadays we have increased the fluence quite significantly and complete the treatment in just about 2 minutes or 3 minutes. And because of this, the corneal rigidity is significantly enhanced, and we have found that this is extremely effective as far as avoiding keratoconus is concerned. This is essentially the initial debridement. The patient, we instilled riboflavin drops every 1 or 2 minutes onto the eye, depending upon the type of riboflavin that's being put on the eye. It could be for a period of 15 minutes or 30 minutes, then expose it onto UV light, and so that this corneal collagen linkage is significantly enhanced. We have found in our series of more than 400 eyes that there have been just 2 eyes which underwent this treatment and subsequently had to go on to a corneal transplant. So this is quite effective. It is not just our series, but there has been worldwide literature support to say that this treatment works quite well. These are the various options that are, this is the UV light that's used, the frequency of it, the dosage of the light that you can use, the duration for exposure. Basically, total time duration remains constant. From 30 minutes exposure initially, by increasing the dosing to 45 milliwatts per centimeter square, we are now completing the treatment in just about 2 minutes, and the accuracy of the beam delivery is also quite accurate. We are also combining it with laser treatment or with a surface epithelial treatment or with laser treatment. I'm using the schematic video because this brings forward the actual way the treatment is done quite very well. Here the laser flap is created either with the microkeratome or the laser, where the correction of the power is achieved, and subsequently we instill the riboflavin eye drops. So essentially in suspect eyes, there was a gynecologist lady who underwent this treatment with very good results almost 12 years back. Her daughter had keratoconus. The second daughter, who just had a -2 diopters power, was very keen on refractive correction. Her eye was absolutely normal. But simply because there was strong family, the sibling had keratoconus, I decided to go ahead and correct the refractive error and do also corneal collagen cross-linkage, which improves the hysteresis of the cornea and reduces any chances of subsequent iatrogenic keratoconus. There are various ways in which these modalities of treatment can be combined together to get an optimal outcome. There's also some who suggest that every hyperopia treatment, you do a corneal collagen cross-linkage, but because hyperos, there is greater tendency for regression to happen. So if you were to fix the cornea at the time of laser treatment, maybe the chance of regression also significantly comes down. What about those patients who have a extremely high refractive error? Very recently, we treated a patient with -28 diopters with -4 diopters of cylinder from Bombay and achieved almost emmetropic outcome in both the eyes. Essentially, today, beyond minus 12 diopters, plus 4 diopters, plus 4 diopters of astigmatism, we do not offer a laser vision correction. Because once you go ahead to higher grades of refractive error, the amount of error that's left behind is quite significant. There could be a loss in the best spectacle corrected visual acuity. And as I already showed you, there could be induction of higher order aberrations, which causes a loss of contrast. The cornea becomes more predisposed to keratocontasia because the amount of tissue that's removed is quite high. And especially if you're treating a higher grade of hyperopia, there's a central bulging of the cornea, and this could induce tear film abnormalities. These are essentially my limits as far as laser vision correction is concerned. Whenever I get a refractive error which is beyond this, or when the cornea is less than 450 microns, I do not do a laser vision correction. If it is 450 to 500 microns, a small refractive error, we offer surface ablation. And if it is beyond that, then we go ahead to what is called a phakic intraocular lens. How is this difference? Basically, you're all familiar with intraocular lens, where the natural lens is removed and you implant a lens for correcting cataract. Here, essentially, the natural lens is retained, and you are putting a lens essentially to correct extremes of refractive error. There are different types of lenses that are available, but what's most widely used today is what's called this ICL, implantable contact lens, which is essentially made up of Collamer material, and which is just about 50 microns in thickness in the center, about 600 microns in the periphery. That's the lens being loaded on, which is essentially has to be done very precisely. Under topical anesthesia, this procedure is done. This is an intraocular procedure. This is a toric ICL that I'm going to use. So it's a 5-degree clockwise rotation of the lens that has been recommended by the manufacturer. So that's the initial marking that I'm doing on the cornea. And you saw that the incisions that I make is at the 6 o'clock and the 12 o'clock meridian, not closer to the main incision. I'm seated temporally, and this is essentially a 2.2 millimeter blade I'm introducing. I need a 3 millimeter incision, so I'm slightly extending this incision on the sides. Then using just a methyl cellulose, and this is just injection of the ICL. This has to be injected the right way up. This comes both in spherical and the toric forms, up to about minus 18 diopters, up to about plus 10 diopters can be corrected. About 6 diopters of astigmatism can be corrected. Those are those small holes. These are the centraflow lenses that have been introduced, and you inject it into the anterior chamber. Subsequently, just tuck this under the iris, and it's a fairly simple procedure. And if it's a toric lens that you're using, you get a toric marking over here that tells you the axis of the steep axis of the particular lens, the flat axis of this particular lens, which is brought in orientation with the steep axis of the cornea that has been marked over here. The entire procedure just takes about 7 to 8 minutes. Because it's an intraocular procedure, we do not do it on the same day in both the eyes. Usually do it on one day, wait for 2 or 3 days, and then subsequently, or even a week's time, and then go ahead and do the second eye. We have found that with the introduction of this technology, the incidence of keratocontasia has significantly gone down, because extremes of refractive error, we do not offer laser vision correction any longer. That's the end of surgery. Just takes about 7 to 8 minutes for each eye. This is the kind of picture that you see on the slit lamp, and there's a kind of wall that should be there, and that is, there's a separation from the back surface of the lens and the front surface of the natural lens. And this should be about 500 microns, almost the thickness of the cornea. If you achieve this by the right sizing that lens, incidence of cataract is extremely small. Bioptics is a term coined where you use a combination of these procedures. Like I mentioned about this patient with an extreme refractive error, about minus 28 with 4 diopters of astigmatism. We initially put in a lens inside the eye, debulked most of the refractive error, then subsequently did a procedure on the surface of the cornea to remove the refractive error. Again, whenever I do a multifocal intraocular lens for the residual error, 3 months later, free of cost, we offer this kind of a upgrade for these patients and an enhancement. Basically, I'm coming to the last few of my slides. This is essentially another procedure that's becoming more widely popular. This is implantation of an intracorneal ring segment. This is again a modality of treatment that's available for keratoconus patients, especially when the cones are somewhat decentered. That was a femtosecond laser that initially created a small plane of cleavage at about the 2/3 the thickness of the cornea. Then he used this simple dissector to open up that. And these are small segments of about 150 degrees each, PMMA segments that are introduced into the eye. This is a reversible procedure, but anytime these can be taken off. Once you introduce, there is a certain amount of flattening of the cone that happens in the center that significantly reduces the amount of refractive error, and that also centers the cone, pushes it to the center, and subsequently you could use even a toric ICL to correct the residual refractive error. Because of the availability of collagen cross-linkage, these procedures, combination of procedures, now I find the requirement for corneal transplantation in keratoconus cases has significantly dropped, and we reserve it only for such of those extreme cases where the cone is beyond 60 diopters, where the protrusion is beyond 60 diopters, or where the thickness of the cornea is less than 350 microns. This is the end of the procedure, and this is what you see on the post-operative pictures with the intracorneal segments in place. This is something which is being talked about only today. In India, it is yet to find a wide acceptance. This is where a inlay has been placed in the eye. Basically, presbyopia is considered the last frontier as far as correction of refractive errors is concerned. And here, because of the small opening that is there, this is supposed to correct, placed in one eye, it's supposed to correct presbyopia also. I think I may not see this in my lifetime, but basically we may move on to refractive surgery. We may give up refractive surgery, but look at more at preventing refractive errors by occurring by molecular and gene therapy. Maybe that is a thing of the future. Who knows? One of you might be involved in putting these concepts forward. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, sir. Just stay on, sir. We'll just have a few quick questions, and since you have finished before time, from the audience, is there somebody who would like to ask a question to Dr. Ramamurthy? In the meanwhile, I'd ask the coordinators to give a mic to Dr. Krishnadas, sir, and Dr. LG, sir, please. A mic to Dr. Krishnadas and to Dr. LG, sir. Anybody from the audience? If there's none, I consider myself a part of the audience. And
there's one person.
Okay,
yeah.
Do go.
Not just questions to me. I think, the idea of this, we had suggested 35 minutes talk and 10 minutes for audience interaction. Not only to me, Dr. Krishnadas, Dr. Gopal, stalwarts in their respective fields, like you people to come forward and express your doubts. Once you break the ice, I'm sure it will keep flowing. Please go ahead.
Sir, when we do C3R for keratoconus, there is a flattening of the cornea that also occurs, around 2 to 3 diopters of flattening. So when you're doing LASIK extra, do you account for that during LASIK extra, or that does not happen?
I think that's an excellent question, and this was a thing we were concerned about. But right now we are not adjusting our nomograms too much. We are just, see, the idea of doing when we are doing a collagen cross-linkage procedure, the PRK extra is what we do more often. Though I showed you a video of a LASIK extra, and in these cases the idea is not to completely correct the refractive error, but to regularize the cornea. We do not remove more than 50 microns of tissue to resurface the corneal surface. But if it's a LASIK extra that I am doing, I usually undercorrect by about 10%, trying to compensate for the kind of flattening that occurs with the collagen cross-linkage.
Anybody else? Quick question, please. We have some time. We have quite a few questions. So, Somil has quite a few questions.
Any questions to even Dr. Krishna sir and LG sir? They're most welcome.
So, for you, sir, what is the guideline of the pre-op PACI before a PRK or a LASIK should be done? What is the amount of PACI that we should leave behind post-LASIK for the corneal stroma?
This has evolved quite a lot. Initially, when we started off, we were just leaving 200 microns in the stroma. Subsequently, we left behind 250 microns. And today, I believe in leaving at least 300 microns in the stroma untreated. Basically, it's because of the problem of iatrogenic keratoconus, all of us recognizing. And the more the amount of tissue that you remove, and lesser the thickness of the stroma that you leave behind, more are the chances of this problem occurring. That's the reason, usually the instrument that I use consumes about 12 microns of tissue for each diopter of correction. That's why this 12 diopters is the maximum that I would treat, which would take away about 130, 140 microns, and then not beyond 500 microns, create a flap of about 90 microns, remove about 100, 110 microns, leave behind at least 300 microns untreated.
Being a little more specific, 1.5 diopters of myopia, 460 microns would you like to treat this patient with PRK?
PRK, yes. Usually my limit for PRK is 450 microns. And again, I would not like to leave behind less than 350, 370 microns untreated. Because you're talking about just a 1.5 diopters,
Yeah.
I would go ahead and do this, but definitely not a LASIK procedure.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Any questions from Dr. Ramurthy? Saumil has a few questions for Dr. Krishnadas, sir. Saumil?
Dr. Krishnadas, sir, I would just like to know from you how many days prior or before cataract surgery do you discontinue prostaglandin analogs, if at all? And if required in the postoperative regimen, if you need to restart them, how many days after the cataract surgery do you restart them?
Basically, a few weeks, 2 to 3 weeks before planned cataract surgery, we normally discontinue prostaglandins. And post-cataract, if we are able to achieve the desired target IOP range with aqueous suppressants, and if they are indicated, we go ahead. And if there is a situation where we anticipate prostaglandin use post-operatively, in general, we plan a combined surgery for them so that the need for medications, or at least the need for prostaglandin analogs post-operatively, will be reduced. Anyway, there would be situations, even though rare, where prostaglandin may be required post-cataract or post-combined. In general, we would like to leave a gap of about 2 to 3 months, if possible. But there is no hard evidence or reports or trials which say that prostaglandins are absolutely contraindicated post-cataract. And in case where we are unable to reach the target IOP post-operatively with aqueous suppressants, and if in your opinion, if the optic nerves or the visual fields are at risk of further progression, there is absolutely no contraindication to use prostaglandins immediately post-operatively. But we may have to closely follow up the vision and the fundus. Sometimes even you may require a fundus angiography if you suspect subclinical CME. But there is absolutely no contraindication. In general, we avoid, if absolutely essential, we add prostaglandins but closely observe.
One more question for you, sir. What do you think is the role of the optic nerve head ONH analysis?
Optic nerve head?
The ONH analysis on the OCT. What is the role? There's a definite guideline and role of the RNFL analysis on the OCT as far as glaucoma is concerned. But what do you feel is the role of the optic nerve head ONH analysis?
Actually, topographic ONH analysis, if available, would be a good supplementary information that will be available with the RNFL thickness. In general, we feel that RNFL loss precedes topographic changes in the optic nerve head. So to diagnose very early glaucoma and to follow up, definitely RNFL thickness is a better parameter to follow than the optic nerve head analysis.
Do you look at the ONH analysis in your daily routine?
We do. The one we have in our center is the HRT, which mostly the topographic optic nerve head morphometric parameters are available. We do follow up.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Any questions to Dr. Lingam-Gopal, sir? Sir, if I can ask you one question. This is about the differentiation of the SICK RPE with the IPCV and recurrent CSCR. How do the DFA as well as the ICG help us there? The SICK RPE, the IPCV and the CSR.
I don't think the ICG will be of much use for RPE health or otherwise. The PPCV is best diagnosed, of course, in ICG because you are going to identify the choroidal polyps. The autofluorescence, yes, tells you that the RPE loss is there. But is RPE sick? To some extent, yes, because autofluorescence is sometimes there is hyper autofluorescence for a relatively sick RPE compared to hypoautofluorescence. As I told you, in the case of geographic atrophy in AMD, we find the edge where the RPE cells are relatively dysfunctional but not totally damaged are actually hyperautofluorescent because there's more lipofuscin being accumulated. The reason why lipofuscin accumulation is indicative of relatively sick RPE is because you know that ultimately that is what triggers all the metabolic dysfunction of the RPE. That means there is so much of lipofuscin being accumulated in that RPE cells that is any time it's going to die, and then it becomes atrophic. Once it's atrophic, you actually get hypoautofluorescence. You get hyperautofluorescence when there's too much of lipofuscin or too much. So that is what is producing the hyperautofluorescence. So hyperautofluorescence could indicate the RPE cell which is relatively dysfunctional. Beyond that, it's not 100% reflective, I agree. Autofluorescence is an indirect tool, it's not a direct tool, but to some extent gives you a guidance. Same thing in central serous retinopathy, yes, RPE cells could be hyperautofluorescent. But again, you don't go only by that. You go by the OCT picture of a collection of subretinal fluid as indicator of active disease. If there is no fluid collection, even if it is hyperautofluorescent, you're not going to treat that patient. It's because you're not going to improve anyway in the terms of vision.
Thank you, sir. Sir, one more question. The follow-up of CNVM is usually through OCT by and large, and most of us do not do a DFA repeatedly. Number one, when is the DFA required in the treatment and the follow-up of CNVM? And number two is, what amount of fluid collection would you call as activity to retreat a patient with recurrence of CNVM?
Okay, maybe I'll answer the last question first. At what stage do you retreat? Between, say, diabetic macular edema or a BRVO-related macular edema versus, say, AMD-related macular edema, we find our threshold for waiting for fluid to collect is very low with AMD. Even a little bit of fluid we inject. We want to keep that macula totally dry. That is the end point of AMD. So there are people who keep on injecting every month for years together because we have found that that gives a better result than waiting for the fluid to recollect. Right? So in general, but for a diabetic macular edema, the foveal contour is good, vision is well maintained, a few pockets of fluid are collected around the fovea, you can still observe. Same thing for a vein occlusion. But for AMD, it reflects, basically fluid collection reflects that the RPE, and so underneath that, a lot of things are happening. A lot of VEGF is being secreted. So you tend to be very aggressive in case of AMD. That's when to treat. When do you do angiography? As I said, before OCT, we were doing angiography to know the level of activity. But we find that very often that in the studies, initial studies of PDT, etc., studies have shown that the angiographic evidence of activity doesn't go pari passu with the activity seen on OCT. In other words, you may have a leaking CNVM on angiography, but the OCT shows the macula is totally dry. So we rely on the OCT rather than the angiography to reach an end point of treatment. So when do you do angiography? Well, as a first stage, when you see a patient with AMD, you would like to do angiography to understand the disease. Is it occult membrane? Is it a classic membrane? Is there PCV, etc., etc.? Because PCV sets it at a different dimension as far as treatment protocol is concerned. People believe that a PCV doesn't respond well too much to anti-VEGF drugs. So you tend to sometimes combine it with either focal laser if it's extrafoveal or with a PDT if it is subfoveal or perifoveal. So to be able to understand whether there's PCV or not, you have to do ICG angiography in addition to fluorescein. So what we do routinely is first time when the patient comes, we always do a fluorescein and ICG angiogram. But subsequently on the treatment, we are going to base upon whether the fluid in the retina is gone or not. So we only rely on OCT. Suppose there's a patient who is not responding well, then you don't know exactly what is happening, then you may do a repeat angiogram. Or somebody who has a recurrence with a bleed under the retina, you may do a repeat angiogram to know whether there's a new polyps. New polyps have developed, so you target that for treatment. So the indications for repeat angiography are really, really extremely low. Mostly we rely on OCT.
Any more questions?
Yes.
While she's coming up, let me tell you, asking a question, the foolishest most question is important. Why? Just remember, a very foolish postgraduate asked Harold Ridley a particular question, and then came the era of intraocular lenses. So ask your foolish questions, they will herald an era. Yes, please.
Morning,
That doesn't
sir.
mean your question is going to be foolish.
There was a slide which was showing a photo of choroidal nevi along with subretinal hemorrhage. So can we differentiate both by fluorescent angiography, or we have to go for a OCT after that to differentiate between choroidal nevi and a subretinal hemorrhage, because both presented with blocked fluorescence? So how
No,
it
I
is
think, as I said, each one of these is just a tool. It allows you to form a picture of the entire elephant by touching the feet, the legs, etc., etc. So you don't go by just one tool to know what is happening. You first examine with ophthalmoscope, and you know very well there's blood subretinally and not sub-RPE, because sub-RPE blood has got a very dark complexion, has got less well-defined borders, unlike a pre-RPE hemorrhage. So you already know whatever is blocking is going to be in front of the RPE. And then you do angiography, you know exactly what it is. It may be rather difficult for you to differentiate between using only angiography, whether the blockage is in front of the RPE but behind the retina, or underneath the RPE. That may be difficult because there is no angiographic way of knowing it. You are either blocking choroidal fluorescence and retinal fluorescence, or only choroidal fluorescence. That's all. That's the only indication you have from fluorescent angiography. You understand my point? Yes, having said this, if you do slit-lamp biomicroscopy, you know exactly where the problem lies, and so you evaluate that with the information from angiography to come to a conclusion. On OCT, a choroidal nevus may not sometimes be even evident. Sometimes if it's very thin, just 1 millimeter and less, you may not be able to see anything on the OCT at all. Maybe a slightly hyperreflective area, but sometimes it may look like a nearly normal retinal pigment epithelium. Okay, and underneath that, you may not see the choroidal nevus that well. So don't go only by one modality of investigation. You always go by a combination. I hope I answered your question. Okay, and to add to what Dr. Partha Biswas said, I'm sure in a class there will always be a few people who ask questions, a few people who don't ask questions. I would like to say that when you ask question, a lot of thought process has taken place before you actually uttered the words out of your mouth. The words will come out only at the end point of a huge process of thinking. That tells you that you have been hearing and you have been able to think on what the person is talking about. So all this is a way of reinforcing knowledge. We know that by one way of scanning the literature, it doesn't stick into your mind. It's not like a computer. You just scan it, it is there as a picture. In your memory, it has to go, stick. It has to be reinforced. And that's one way of reinforcing. By asking a question, already the pieces are in place, the jigsaw puzzle is in place. You only have to put them a little better, and that answer from your question would have given you that specific information. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And if there are no other questions, would you like... Oh, there is one more. Come, quick, come. At least we have inspired questioners.
I would like to ask question from Dr. Ramamurthy, sir. Sir, in case of double bubble technique, sir, in
Double
case of
bubble, not in the purview, I think.
Corneal transplant?
I've read in recent advances, that is why I'm asking. In case of double bubble technique, if we inject a bubble inside the anterior chamber to locate the thickness of the stroma that should be removed, so how would we assess that? By injecting a bubble inside the AC?
No, you'll have to be a little more clearer. The double bubble technique is used in DISEC,
Yes,
It's
sir.
for
DC.
corneal transplant.
in
when
corneal
you talk about-
transplant.
Yes, sir.
So, refractive session. But no, go ahead. I mean, your friend, please ask your question properly. Absolutely, please feel free to ask it. And if your friend would like to help you, why don't you help her? No, tell me, you would have a point.
Sir, I'm asking, we inject air bubble in double bubble technique.
Yeah.
We inject an air bubble where first in one bubble is injected inside the AC now.
No, yeah,
No.
it's...
There is no bubble injected into the AC. For the, for
the
essentially for
DISEC,
tensing up the eyeball.
Yeah.
I suggest you, frankly, I don't do cornea work. There will be a senior person talking on cornea, maybe you could reserve that question for that. You would get a more considerate answer in that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, go
would
ahead.
you be speaking about the OBL? Are you speaking?
No. She's talking about Dalkundi.
Dalkonde. Shall we break for tea?
No, he's...
What is the site of insertion of phakic IOLs? Exact site, exact location?
What do you do if a phakic IOL and a cataract is there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. See, basically, one major concern we had when we are starting off with phakic ICLs, which is put in the posterior segment, posterior chamber, is that cataracts may be formed. But because the inherent vault of these lenses, the incidence of cataract is extremely small. And even in the FDA controlled study where 400 eyes were properly followed, there was just a 1.6% of cataract. Even in that, only one was visually causing a handicap and the cataract had to be removed. Having said that, if you come across this situation, and we ourselves have handled it in a couple of cases, where we just bring the ICL into the anterior chamber, and that's easily possible using the spatula that you use to tuck it in, and subsequently using the same 3 millimeter incision that you initially made to introduce the lens inside, you can open that up and remove this lens. This being a colamer is a hydrophilic material which easily folds upon itself, and you can remove the lens. And as far as IOL power calculation is concerned, it's really no challenge. And if you are doing intraocular lens after cataract surgery, after laser vision correction, you have changed the entire profile of the cornea, so there are various formulae, various things to be applied. But here the cornea remains pristine. The ultrasound is just passing through 50 micron thickness of the central lens material. And it hardly has any impact as far as the IOL power calculation is concerned. So you can go ahead with your normal mode of power calculation and go ahead and implant the lens at the right power.
Thank you, sir.
Fine. We come to the end of the session and a quick tea, and do rush back because we have great speakers in the next session. Dr. Jitendra Jathani is the next speaker, and he's a phenomenal speaker. So quick, have a cup of tea and rush back. Thank you very much. I would like to thank, on behalf of SAWMIL, Dr. Ramamurthy, Dr. Krishnadas, and Dr. LG sir for their very, very valuable presence. Thank you, sir.